In person from Little Rock, a public service program of the UALR School of Mass Communication. You'll be hearing from internationally known speakers who have participated in recent Little Rock forums focusing on a variety of critical and compelling issues.
February the 19th, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Order 9066, relocating 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast into 10 concentration camps. About 19,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated in 2 camps in southeast Arkansas. One of those camps was in the center of a cotton field at Rower, about 12 miles north of McGee, and the other a few miles away in a field near the small community of Jerome, not far from Dermont. The first internees arrived by train at Rower on September the 18th, 1942, and at Jerome on October the 6th of the same year. They came from California and Hawaii, with peak populations reaching almost 8,500 people at each camp. Both were larger than many Arkansas towns, and each had school systems. In the audience today is Flory Dean Lyle, who taught at Jerome. Ms. Lyle, would you wave and be recognized? Ms. Lyle is at the young age of 94 years old, and she taught at Jerome. Jerome closed on June 30th, 1944, and Rower closed on November 30th, 1945. At Rower, a cemetery with 24 graves and 4 monuments and an abandoned smokestack are about the only things that remain. At Jerome, there is a small monument. Most Americans, as I noted, don't even know these camps, and many who do and know about them want to forget about them. Still, at their peaks, they were larger than most Arkansas communities. Among the people who were incarcerated in Arkansas were Clinton School professor Keith Nita's grandmother. Keith's mother was actually born at the camp, and George Takei, Mr. Sulu on Star Trek. Both were at the Arkansas camps. Rosalie Gould, a former mayor of McGee, is the premier authority on these camps. She has been collecting items from the camps and from former internees and their families. On a regular basis, she opens her home to the many Japanese Americans who visit these sites. She's spoken about these sites all over the state and the country. And ladies and gentlemen, her collection of artifacts is one of the nation's most historically significant. With the sweep of a presidential pen, 120,000 Japanese Americans lost their homes, their possessions, their civil rights. They were separated from their families and were forced into camps in the middle of nowhere, 2 of which were in the great state of Arkansas. One strong Arkansas woman has been at the forefront to make sure these stories are never forgotten and that something like this would never, ever happen again in this country and in our state. Ladies and gentlemen, you're in for a real treat. Please welcome the former mayor of McGee, the Honorable Rosalie Gould.
I want to thank you for letting me come today to speak about this subject that is really, really dear to my heart. It's something that I have worked on for 30 years. And as Dean Rutherford told you, I welcome many, many, many Japanese Americans to my home. And I'm here to tell you that they are some of the most important people I have ever known and the warmest I have ever known. I do want to thank my friends for coming today, especially my daughter Lee and my son Clayton. And I want to welcome the rest of you and hope that in this very short time, I will be able to tell you a little bit about this secret that was occurring in southeast Arkansas during World War II. 62 years ago, on November the 30th, 1945, the United States government closed their books on a terrible blight on the history of our great nation. On that day, exactly 62 years ago, this coming Friday, the internment camp at Roar auctioned off its entire contents and closed its doors. The camp at Roar was the last of the 10 to be closed because the state of California did not want the internees returning. That is the end of the story. To go back to the beginning, on December the 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and sank almost the entire United States Pacific Fleet. They also bombed Hickam Field and almost completely destroyed every plane on the ground. On December the 8th, President Roosevelt went before Congress and asked that Congress declare war not only on Japan, but also Germany and Italy. And of course, Congress immediately granted him his request. Then President Roosevelt, because of the outcry of the people on the West Coast, President Roosevelt signed Order 9102, which created the WRA, known as War Relocation Authority. This authority was to maintain, relocate, and supervise the Japanese American population on the West Coast, including California, Washington, and Oregon. The 10 camps were to have been built on federally owned land, located a safe distance from strategic areas, on a railroad, and capable of handling 9,000 to 10,000 population. On February the 19th, 1942, Roosevelt signed Order 9066, giving the Secretary of the Secretary of War, the authority to detain the Japanese Americans. General DeWitt signed Civilian Exclusion Order Number 5 on April the 1st, 1942, and this order gave the instructions to be followed by these internees. Evacuees, by the way, they were not called internees, they were called evacuees when they were placed in the camps, and the camps were called evacuation camps. Evacuees must carry with them on departure for the reception center the following: beddings and linens, no mattresses, for each member of the family; toilet articles for each member of the family; extra clothing for each member of the family; sufficient knives, forks, spoons, plates, bowls, and cups for each member of the family. We were told that the Army provided the cups and the utensils, but evidently they didn't. After finding this, I see they didn't. Essential personal effects for each member of the family, and all items must be securely packaged with their name on them, and they will be taken to the evacuation center. By January the 4th, 1942, the WRA had selected the 10 sites for the 10 camps. There were Hilo Bend, Grenada, Hart Mountain, Jerome, Manzanar, Minidoka, Poston, Roar, Topaz, and Tule Lake. Tule Lake was the only prison camp in the 10. It was a prison camp because when the internees first arrived at their camp, they were given the loyalty oath to sign. Those who refused to sign were called no-no boys, and they were sent to Tule Lake, which was literally a prison. In July 1942, the Army began rounding up the Japanese Americans. Those in the Roar camp were from the Los Angeles, Torrance area. They were given 5 days to sell their belongings or give away their belongings and pack one suitcase to take with each member of the family. The Army trucks took these evacuees to the Santa Anita racetracks. The horses were removed from the stalls. The stalls were whitewashed, fresh hay was put on the ground, and cots were put in these stalls. The evacuees were put into the stalls, and some stayed there 3 weeks and some stayed there 3 months before they were removed to one of the 10 camps. Fortunately, the Santa Anita races were canceled for the duration of the housing of the Japanese Americans. That is one of the things that was written in the book. Construction in Roar began in July 1942 and lasted till January of 1943. They were still doing construction when the Japanese Americans were moved in. You've got to remember, the site in Roar that was selected belonged to my father-in-law, and it was more or less a swamp. It had never been cleared or anything, so they had to clear the trees out and do a little bit of drainage. And of course, the Japanese Americans had never seen the snakes that we had, and they were really amazed to see these snakes just going around everywhere. And when these Japanese Americans arrived, it was winter, so they had to walk on boardwalks because there was so much mud around. You know, when you first clear land, it's really rough, and so they did not know where in the world they were or what was going on. The cost of the construction was $4,800,558, and it was under contract to Landberger of Little Rock. The Roar site was 650 acres of barracks arranged in rows in numbered blocks. Each block accommodated almost 300 people in 10 to 14 residential blocks. Each barracks was 20 feet by 120 feet, divided into 4 to 6 apartments. Each block also had a mess hall, recreational building, laundry, latrine. There was no running water in the residential barracks. As the resident arrived, they found in their room only a cot for each person and a stove and blankets. That was literally all that they found in their rooms. Each internee was provided with a warm coat as it was winter. The camp also had a military police station, hospital, warehouse, schools, churches, fire station. All activities found in any city was found in the camp. The town of Roar at this time, remember, this was just after the Depression. Roar had no running water, they had no sewers, no electricity, no telephones, and were under rationing. The camp had all of these advantages. At first, when the Japanese Americans were brought in, the people in Roar knew absolutely nothing about what was happening. The government never told the people in Arkansas what these camps were. It was a well-kept secret until in the later years when people like me started wondering just what in the world had happened in this place. I never saw the camp because I was at the University of Arkansas during this time, so I missed all of that. The food was brought in by train, and of course fresh fruit and vegetables and everything were brought in. The farmers in Roar that had hogs and cattle were allowed into the camp to take all of the leftover food to feed to their livestock. At first, there was a lot of resentment by the local people because they saw all of the fruit and vegetables that were being thrown away, and they were under rationing and could not, of course, have any of these vegetables. But soon, when the internees first arrived, they were behind barbed wire, and there were 4 guard towers. After about a month, everyone was of the opinion, fortunately, that where were the Japanese Americans going? There was the only place they could go would be on a train, and of course the train was not going to stop for them. And if you saw a Japanese American running around in Roar, where there were nothing but African Americans and Caucasians, you would certainly know that they were out of camp. But after the first month, the guards got down out of the tower, and the internees were allowed outside of the camp. They had Boy Scouts. The Boy Scouts went to the river and camped. and they swam in the blue holes. And the parents were given surrounding areas for which they could plant their vegetables, seeds that they brought from California. And of course, they planted some vegetables that were strange to us because we had never seen eggplants or Brussels sprouts or rutabagas or so forth. And they irrigated those crops. By this irrigation, they taught the Rower farmer how to irrigate, and that brought in the rice crops, which are now one of our main crops in our area. The camp was under the direction of Ray Johnson. Life in the camp eroded the tightly knit life of the Japanese American community. Communal dining rooms and communal activities made it possible for the young people to slip out of the grasp of their parents and grandparents. The privacy so highly prized by the Japanese Americans was no longer available. When the relocation center closed, 120 acres were deeded to the local school district. Deshae Central School District originally used the barracks as classrooms. My children attended school in those barracks until we moved to McGee. Those and all the remaining buildings burned in the late 50s. When the Japanese Americans arrived in the camps, the young men were devastated to think that they were not considered loyal Americans. So they formed a regiment called the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, of which the 100th Battalion was part of that. A young Japanese American man joined the 442nd with this advice from his father: don't dishonor our country, don't dishonor our family, and if you were to die, die with honor. This young man was later given the Medal of Honor. The 442nd was inspired with a high sense of honor and patriotism. They were driven to prove that they were loyal Americans. At the Life Interrupted that Dr. Lewis so ably put on, Senator Inouye told us about the training they received at Camp Shelby at Hattiesburg, Mississippi. He said that the young soldiers who came over from the islands and the young soldiers who were mainlanders did not get along. They fought all the time that they were in camp together training until one weekend when they were invited to Rower to a dance. The senator said when they topped the railroad and saw the barbed wire and the guard towers, he thought they were coming to a military installation. And he said they were horrified to find that it was not a military installation. It was a camp where their countrymen were being held while they were being trained to fight for these people who were being detained in these camps. And he said when they returned to Camp Shelby, there was never one bit of fighting or infighting or any dissension between any of them. They were determined that they were going to be the most loyal Americans that anyone ever hoped to see. In the Pacific theater, the Japanese Americans answered the call when the United States Army needed Japanese-speaking specialists for military and combat duty. The MIS, they were called the MIS, Military Intelligence Service, were made up of Japanese Americans who were invaluable with their services, and their missions included interrogating Japanese prisoners, intercepting messages, translating captured documents, and infiltrating enemy lines. Most of their contributions are still classified. It is thought that they were responsible for saving countless lives and shortened the war in the Pacific by 2 years. Lee and I attended the dedication of the Japanese American internment camp memorial in Washington, D.C. in 2000. At the dinner that night, we were seated at the table with his two darling gentlemen, Japanese-American gentlemen. We introduced ourselves, and they did too. One of them was Roy Matsumoto, and the other was Grant Hirabayashi. And Roy's parents had been interned in the Roar camp, and he had heard them speak of me because they had been to the house visiting. And he said, Rosalie, did you know anything about Merrill's Marauders in the CBI theater, the China Burner in India? And I said, of course, his Marauders were the top fighting area in that theater. He said, what was not known is that 12 of us Japanese Americans, the MIS, fought with General Merrill. And he said we would infiltrate the lines and talk to the Japanese and then come back and tell General Merrill what they were planning, or we would tap into their telephones and tell General Merrill. And Roy said, well, this specific night, he said, I heard them say they would be attacking us at dawn. So he immediately went to General Merrill and told General Merrill. General Merrill said, everybody pull back from the front foxholes and put all of the explosives that we have into there, and said, we'll pull back and wait on them in the morning. And Roy said, well, we waited, and we waited, and we waited. He said, I finally just couldn't wait any longer. He said, when I was a teenager, I spent some time in Japan, and I was fascinated by the military history. So I knew what to do when they called for an attack. So he said, just before dawn, I couldn't wait any longer. So I jumped up over the top of a foxhole, and he said, I jerked off my shirt and yelled in Japanese, attack, attack. And he said, Rosalie, they came running out of their camps with just their underclothes on, no shoes, and they grabbed their guns and started to cross. And said, of course, they jumped in the foxholes first, and explosions set off. And then he said, said all the Japanese were killed, and said we suffered very little casualties, and said that was because of these 12 men. And he said there were so many other exploits that we did, said they were in 4 books. These 4 books were out of print, but I was fortunate enough to find 2 of them, and I sent them to Roy and Grant when they went to a reunion of Merrill's Marauders, and they had 40 to 50 of the Marauders autograph those books, so they are 2 of my prized possessions. In the European battlefield, the 10442nd made military history that is unsurpassed today. They were awarded 18,143 individual decorations, including 9,500 Purple Hearts. The 21 members received the Medal of Honor, which is something that one regiment usually doesn't receive, and 7 received the Presidential Unit Citations. Now listen to this. 866 men left the Roar camp to fight with the 442nd. And if you don't think that's not patriotism, I don't know what in the world you would call it. The Japanese are known for their poetry, and I have many of the poetry that they wrote while they were in the camp. I ran across this one. It's a very short one, and I think you will really enjoy it because humor in their poetry was something that kept them going. This one, the Lord gave us 2 ends to use, one to sit with, one to think with. The war depends on which we choose. Heads we win, tails we lose. I thought that absolutely told the whole story. I mean, I could stop right there because that would, have I overstayed my time? Because when I start talking about the camps, I can talk for hours until somebody stands up and says, okay, that's enough, sit down. When the camp closed, they had a big auction. And 6 years ago, the young man who was in charge of, the young officer who was in charge of the auction came to my house and wanted to see what I had because he remembered the auction and had often wondered what happened to the camps, what happened to the people. And so I was able to show him, show him my guest book where every Japanese American or his family or university personnel or whoever it is that comes will sign my books. This is the site, the sale for the site. And the things for sale were the cafeteria equipment, kitchen equipment, automobile repair parts, warehousing aids, janitorial supplies, builder's hardware, surgical equipment, hospital, laboratory, nursing equipment, office furniture, fire extinguisher, bedspreads, comforters, shoes. Who in the world wants to buy the shoes after they had been worn? But I guess they did. By the way, I didn't tell you, the hospital and all were run by the Japanese Americans, the doctors and the nurses. They had, in fact, this was, as I heard Dean Rutherford tell you, the fourth largest city in Arkansas at that time. So they had everything that any city would have, and all the churches were in the camp from the Protestants, Catholics, Buddhism, or whatever. So they, in one way, they didn't miss anything because they had had all the advantages of a city where the people in Roar really didn't. As Dean Rutherford told you, the only thing left are the 24 graves and 4 monuments. The first monument was built in 1944 by the internees. They were able to not steal, but scrounge around while Director Johnson turned his back to get the concrete and whatever to build the camp. The first one was a tall spire topped by an eagle with these words in Japanese on it: "May the people of Arkansas keep in beauty and reverence forever this ground where our bodies sleep." And let me tell you, when you touch that monument and read what those words say, it touches you, because it seems like when you touch these monuments, you can feel the hands of these Japanese Americans or their spirits. Well, I'm not new age or anything, but there is something there that just brings you back to those people who were there. The second monument is in the form of a tank, and it honors the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and it was built in 1945. In 1992, when we had the 50th anniversary of the building of the camps, one of the gentlemen who built the first monument came back, and I had architectural students and engineers there wanting to know how in the world they got the carvings and all on these monuments, because they were not like other monuments. And he told me, he said, they built the monument, then they took plywood and black electrical tape and made the form of whatever they wanted and put it on the plywood. Then they put the plywood next to the monument and poured the concrete down there, and when it hardened, they pulled it away, and I told him, I said, well, nobody could figure out how you did it, and he said, well, that was just the way they did things. So, see, you always learn something from somebody. I didn't tell you, but the only family that stayed in Arkansas after the camp closed was the Yatta family, and Richard was born in the camp. So Richard and my children are Roarites. And Mr. Sam Yatta and Ms. Yatta were absolutely, Mr. Yatta, of course, is no longer living, but they were absolutely two of the dearest people I've ever met. Mr. Yatta was so soft-spoken, but he got everything done that he wanted to do, and he spent his life making sure that the site was kept in perfect management so that if anyone came back, they would know that someone cared about the camp, and Mr. Yotta will never be forgotten because he was one of my dear friends. So in 1981, I was living in McGee, and the president of the Chamber of Commerce told me he wanted me to host a dinner for returning internees who were coming to dedicate this monument that Mr. Yotta had commissioned. And it was at that dinner that night that I met three people who had a lasting effect on me. The first one was, of course, Mr. Yotta. I never forgot him. The second was Jamie Vogel, who was the teacher, who was the art teacher at the school. In her wisdom, Jamie saved hundreds of paintings and drawings and carvings and documents that are just absolutely priceless. And when Jamie died, she willed those to me, and those are the main part of my collection. But every time an internee comes back and he sees my collection, he'll say, I have so-and-so, would you like to have it? And of course I would. It's just they know that I would treasure it as much as they do, and so that's the way my collection has grown. I was going to tell you about this monument. It was dedicated to the young men from the Rower camp who died in the European theater. The fourth bears a plaque declaring the site a national landmark. Let me go back, I forgot the third person. The third person was a man whose name was George Sakaguchi. George lived in St. Louis. He was a retired major in the Air Force, and his parents had been interned in Rower. Well, George was a fine person, but George was tight with his money, let's put it that way. George loved to come down to the McGee area and visit with all of us. And he would always find a way to get an Air Force plane to fly from St. Louis to the Jacksonville area, and he'd either rent a car or he'd call, Rosalie, come get me, I'm in Little Rock. And I'd say, okay, so I'd go get him. George was a planner. He planned everything. In 1991, he called me and he said, Rosalie, next year is the 50th anniversary of the building of the camp. I think we should have a celebration. I said, okay. He said, well, I want you to do this, I want you to do this, I want you to do this. And I said, fine. What are you going to do, George? Somebody has to plan it. That was him. So sure enough, we had the dedication. It was a huge success. Then later in 1991, he came to me and he said, Rosalie, I see, well, Manzanar has been declared a national landmark by the National Park Service. And he says, I think Rower should be so named. And I said, okay, George. He said, well, I'll bring the papers and we'll fill them out. Well, we filled them out and sent them to him. I sent them to the National Park Service. And, excuse me just a minute. I have the president's problem. I have sinus trouble. So he said, okay. He said, I'll let you know when I hear from him. Well, he called one day just heartbroken. He said, Rosalie, they turned us down. They said that we didn't have a Japanese-American community anywhere around, and there was no interest in the camp. And I said, oh, George, that's terrible. He said, I'll tell you what we're going to do. He says, they're going to be meeting, I don't have very much longer. We'll be meeting in New Orleans, and he says, I'll go down and talk to them. George went down and talked to them, and sure enough, they reversed themselves and granted Rower the second national landmark status. He came back up and said, well, we're going to have a dedication, said, now, I want you to do this, I want you to do that, I want you to do that other. I said, George, what are you going to do? Somebody's got to plan it. So that was his idea. I have been fortunate that I have really met so many of the former internees since I began this project. I have been keynote speaker at many reunions and have thoroughly enjoyed meeting all the different people. You remember the old television program that said, there are a million cities in the naked city. Well, I think there are 10,000 stories in the Roar camp, but of course, I just want to tell you about one because I can't tell you about all of them. My first keynote speech was at a reunion in Denver, and Lee and I attended that. And during that speech, I apologized for the internment of these people. After the speech, as I was talking to the people, this young woman came up with her grandfather, and tears were streaming down his face. He grabbed my hand and he said, "Mayor Gould, in all these years, you're the only person who has ever apologized for our years in prison." He said, "I will never forget you." Well, of course, that broke my heart, but it made me feel great. 2 weeks later, his granddaughter called and she said, "Mayor Gould, my grandfather died." She said, but for these 2 weeks, he was just as happy as he could be because, as he said, somebody cared. The debate over the internment camps will rage on forever. Was it wrong? Were there senator causes for the camps? Should the Japanese Americans have fought their internment? 1941 was a different world from today. There was no instant communications, no cell phone, no internet. During World War II, soldiers went sometimes months or years without hearing from home. Everyone believed the government did what was right and did only what was right for their citizens. Now soldiers fighting overseas have cell phones and can speak to their families daily. My son called the 24 graves at Roar Pottersfield because for so long they were scorned. That might have been true in the past, but today that is no longer true. These dead are given the honor they deserve. You who today are enrolled in the Clinton School have the opportunity to study the causes and effect of the 10 camps, that what they accomplished or what terrible wrongs they created. Only by researching the many interviews given by the Japanese Americans and trying to see into the minds of the West Coast leaders, their jealousies and concerns, can you help shape our governmental actions in the future. You must keep an open mind. Is it better to chance an attack by our enemies in the United States, or should our enemies real or imagined be interned as those imagined enemies of 62 years ago? I am sure that whenever this subject comes up, the internment camps will also come to mind. No matter what decision is made, there will always be divisions. No decision is perfect. Only your conscience will be your guide. Many have, I'm just about through, Dean. You won't have to, you won't have to stand up and shut me up. Many have returned to their roots in Arkansas. As they remember their time in this strange place called Arkansas, they marvel at the change. Often they say, "Rosalie, where is this place? Where are we, and what were we doing here?" I often recite this short poem by Patrick O'Leary. I think you will enjoy it. There's a place I travel when I want to roam, and nobody knows it but me. The roads don't go there, and the signs stay home, and nobody knows it but me. It's far, far away, and way, way afar. It's over the moon and the sea, and wherever you're going, that's wherever you'll be, and nobody knows it but me. Thank you.
This has been In Person from Little Rock, a public service program produced by the UALR School of Mass Communication.